The wooden horse lay shattered in Catherine's trembling hands, its delicate carved mane splintered beyond repair. She could still hear Joseph Little Thunder's voice from 3 months ago, small, uncertain speaking in the mixture of Lakota and English that had marked him as a child caught between worlds. "Sister Catherine, will the new family let me keep my horses?" She'd promised they would sign the papers with careful precision, watch 7-year-old fingers clutch his remaining carvings as soldiers led him to the eastbound wagon. Now she knelt in Dakota snow with 20 Lakota arrows aimed at her heart, fragments of childhood dreams cutting into her palms, while Standing Bear's warriors waited for their chief's word to end her life. "Do you serve the ones who steal our children?" Standing Bear set his scarred face impassive as winter stone. "You wear the black robes of those who speak of salvation while practicing damnation. Give me one reason we should not send you to join your God." "Sister Catherine, Catherine McKenna." She corrected herself, no longer worthy of religious titles, looked up from the broken horse to meet the chief's dark eyes. Behind him, steam rose from hidden hot springs that kept this valley habitable despite the killing cold evidence of Lakota knowledge that 3 years at the mission school had never taught her to recognize. "Because I know where your children are." She whispered, her breath forming clouds that dissipated like the faith she'd lost. "And I know how to bring them home." Standing Bear's expression didn't change, but she saw his hand signal the warriors to hold their aim. "Speak quickly, white woman. Winter is not patient with liars." Catherine pulled the financial ledgers from beneath her torn coat, spreading Morrison's carefully documented crimes across the blood-stained snow. "Your nephew wasn't adopted by a Christian family, Chief Standing Bear. He was sold to a textile mill in Massachusetts for $43. Bright Star works 16 hours a day in a Pennsylvania munitions factory. They're slaves, all of them." 4 months earlier, Catherine had walked the mission school grounds with the measured pace of righteousness, believing herself an instrument of divine mercy in a land that needed civilizing. The Lakota children in her care sat in rigid rows, their traditional braids shorn to regulation length, their buckskin clothing replaced with rough wool uniforms that chafed against skin accustomed to softer materials. She'd taught them arithmetic using problems about farming yields and factory production geography, through maps that showed their homeland divided into territories and townships, scripture that promised salvation through submission to proper authority. Each lesson was a small victory over paganism, each converted child a soul snatched from darkness. Colonel Morrison had praised her monthly reports with the satisfaction of a man whose investments were paying expected dividends. "The adoption program continues to exceed projections, Sister Catherine. 17 placements this month alone, excellent progress in civilizing these young savages." She'd nodded with genuine pleasure, proud of her role in providing worthy children with opportunities their primitive families could never offer. Joseph Little Thunder had been among the success stories, a bright boy whose skill with numbers suggested potential for bookkeeping or accounting in whatever eastern city would become his new home. The child asked about keeping his wooden toys. She'd mentioned to Morrison while reviewing placement documents. "Might we allow 1 or 2 as comfort items during transition?" Morrison's laugh had held no warmth. "Sister, those crude carvings represent exactly the kind of backward thinking we're trying to eliminate. The boy's new family will provide proper toys, educational materials that prepare him for productive citizenship, rather than romantic notions about noble savages." Catherine had signed the adoption papers anyway, believing that Joseph's temporary disappointment would yield to gratitude once he experienced the benefits of civilized society. The wooden horses had been discarded with other heathen artifacts that interfered with proper assimilation. She discovered the truth 3 weeks later, finding scattered wood chips in the empty dormitory, where Joseph's bed had been stripped and assigned to his replacement. Hidden beneath loose floorboards were fragments of his carvings, not discarded by careless soldiers, but deliberately hidden by a child who'd known he was being stolen rather than saved. The horses weren't crude toys. They were memorial sculptures carved with extraordinary skill to honor the grandfather who taught Joseph to ride before cavalry bullets ended their time together. Each piece bore details that spoke of deep cultural knowledge, traditional tack arrangements, specific bloodlines, ceremonial markings that connected the boy to generations of horsemen. Joseph Little Thunder wasn't an orphan being saved from poverty. He was an artist being torn from his heritage, a child with living family being sold into industrial slavery under legal papers that Catherine had signed without reading carefully enough to recognize their true purpose. That night, Catherine had searched military records with growing horror, discovering patterns that transformed charitable adoption into commercial trafficking. Parents listed as dead who'd actually fled cavalry raids. Children classified as orphans, whose grandparents lived within walking distance of the school. Adoption agencies that were actually labor contractors supplying Eastern factories with workers too young to organize for better conditions. The beautiful Christian families described in placement documents existed, but they weren't adopting Indian children for love. They were purchasing contract workers whose legal status made them cheaper than adult employees and easier to control than immigrant laborers who might eventually demand wages. Catherine had confronted Morrison the next morning carrying Joseph's broken horses as evidence of a crime that dwarfed any frontier atrocity she'd imagined. Colonel, these adoption records contained significant discrepancies regarding family status and placement conditions. Sister Catherine. Morrison had interrupted his voice, carrying warning that made her stomach clench. Perhaps the isolation has affected your judgment. The territorial climate can be challenging for those of delicate constitution. Reassignment to a more remote mission might provide necessary perspective. The threat was clear. Question nothing, sign everything, or face consequences that could destroy her vocation and her future both. But holding Joseph's carved horses while watching Morrison's satisfied smile, Catherine had felt something crystallize in her chest, not faith lost, but faith redirected toward children who deserve protection rather than exploitation. Of course, Colonel, she'd agreed, recognizing the need for subtlety in confronting corruption that reached beyond individual greed. I'm certain you have the children's best interests at heart. That evening, she'd ridden to the creek bend, where 3 cottonwoods stood like sentinels against endless sky, their roots deep enough to reach water that flowed year-round despite surface freezing. Hidden in a cavity she'd discovered during botanical studies, Catherine had left her first message for whoever might listen. Colonel Morrison plans winter raids on northern camps. 40 cavalry under Captain Reynolds 3 days hence. Children taken will not return to families. The response had come within hours, a single eagle feather tied to her windowsill with sinew attached to nothing but carrying meaning that transcended words. Someone had received her warning. Someone cared enough to acknowledge her transformation from enemy to ally, however tentative that alliance might prove. For 2 months, Catherine had walked the knife's edge between worlds passing military intelligence, while maintaining cover that grew more fragile with each message delivered. She'd learned to encode information using botanical terminology, hide photographs in medical supply shipments, coordinate warnings through seemingly innocent requests for herbal remedies from tribal healers. Each successful interception felt like penance. For signatures written in ignorance, each rescued family a small weight, lifted from conscience that carried the burden of every child she'd failed to protect. But penance wasn't enough, not when Joseph's replacement had arrived with the same defiant spirit and careful hands already beginning to carve memories that Morrison would soon erase. Catherine's transformation from passive accomplice to active resistance had accelerated when she discovered Morrison's private files during a supply inventory that required access to his office safe. The financial records inside had revealed the true scope of his operation, not scattered adoption services, but systematic trafficking that generated thousands of dollars monthly through coordinated sales of child labor to Eastern industrial interests. More disturbing were the names throughout the correspondence. Senators who owned stock in companies that purchased Indian labor. military commanders who received percentages of profits generated by their pacification efforts, church officials who blessed the operation while taking donations from grateful industrialists who praised their commitment to civilizing savage youth. The trafficking network reached from frontier forts to Washington, drawing rooms protected by men whose power extended far beyond territorial jurisdiction. Morrison wasn't a rogue officer pursuing personal enrichment. He was a middle manager implementing federal policy designed to eliminate tribal culture through systematic separation of children from their heritage. Catherine had photographed everything using a camera borrowed from the quartermaster's office, hiding the evidence in her medical kit while preparing for the most dangerous decision of her life. If she could reach Chief Standing Bear with proof of the conspiracy, if she could coordinate rescue efforts before Morrison discovered her activities, the children might have a chance at freedom. But Morrison had been monitoring her activities more carefully than she'd realized. The summons had come at dawn. Report to headquarters immediately for urgent consultation regarding medical supplies distribution. Catherine had arrived to find Morrison flanked by Sergeant O'Brien and Lieutenant Hayes, the young officer's face, troubled by whatever role he'd been assigned in the morning's proceedings. "Sister Catherine." Morrison had set his pale eyes bright with satisfaction. "We've intercepted communications suggesting treasonous correspondence with hostile Indian forces. Lieutenant Hayes discovered evidence during routine security inspections." Hayes had stepped forward reluctantly, holding a manila folder that made Catherine's blood turn cold. Inside were photographs of her own messages, apparently copied before delivery to Standing Bear's forces. Her handwriting, her intelligence, her betrayal documented with damning precision. "I'm sorry, sister." Hayes had whispered, his voice barely audible. "The colonel said." He said the communications contained information about medical emergencies in Indian camps. I thought I was helping document humanitarian assistance." Morrison's smile had been triumphant. "Lieutenant Hayes has proven admirably thorough in his duties, documenting every message you've passed to hostile forces over the past 8 weeks. Would you care to explain why a Catholic nun has been providing military intelligence to Indians engaged in warfare against American settlers?" Catherine's mind had raced through explanations that might preserve her cover, but Morrison's evidence was too comprehensive to deflect with partial truths. Hayes had been manipulated into betraying her activities, probably through appeals to military duty that disguised the young officer's unwitting participation in trafficking operations. "You have 2 choices, sister," Morrison had continued. "Resign immediately and return east, never to interfere with territorial affairs again. Or face court-martial for treason with execution as the likely outcome given wartime conditions." Standing in Morrison's office while winter light filtered through frost-covered windows, Catherine had recognized the moment that would define everything she'd become. Accept exile and abandon the children to their fates, or challenge corruption that extended far beyond her individual capacity to combat. She'd chosen a third option that surprised everyone present. "Sir Colonel Morrison," she'd said, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. "Before you proceed with charges, perhaps you'd like to explain these financial records to federal investigators." She'd pulled copies of his trafficking documentation from her medical bag, spreading the evidence across his desk like cards in a poker game, where lives, rather than money, constituted the stakes. Morrison's face had gone pale as he'd recognized his own handwriting on correspondence that connected him directly to systematic child trafficking. "You're bluffing," he'd whispered. "You have no way to contact federal authorities." "The territorial circuit judge is due for quarterly inspection next week," Catherine had replied calmly. "These documents will be waiting for him, along with sworn testimony from witnesses who can verify their authenticity and explain their implications." It had been pure bluff. Catherine had no contacts with federal officials, no guarantee that territorial judges would act on evidence of corruption they might be profiting from themselves. But uncertainty was her greatest weapon against men whose power depended on controlling information flow. Morrison had calculated odds and angles for several minutes before reaching his decision. Sergeant O'Brien placed Sister Catherine under protective custody while we investigate these allegations. We can't risk false accusations damaging legitimate adoption services that benefit Indian children. Sir. Hayes had interjected, his young face troubled by implications he was beginning to understand. If these documents are authentic, shouldn't we be contacting federal investigators immediately? Lieutenant Morrison had replied sharply. You'll follow orders without questioning their rationale. Sister Catherine has made serious accusations that require careful verification before involving outside authorities. As O'Brien had escorted her to quarters that were comfortable but clearly secured, Catherine had recognized both opportunity and danger in her changed circumstances. Morrison couldn't risk killing her, while Hayes remained present as witness. But he also couldn't afford to let her testimony reach federal authorities who might investigate his operations. She'd had perhaps 24 hours before Morrison resolved his dilemma through methods that would eliminate her as a threat, while maintaining plausible deniability about her fate. That evening, confined to a storeroom that served as improvised detention while Morrison decided her future, Catherine had used her medical knowledge to create a diversion that would provide escape opportunity. Mixing chemicals from her kit with cleaning supplies left by careless guards, she'd generated smoke that triggered fire alarms throughout the administrative building. In the confusion of evacuation procedures, she'd slipped away from guards who'd prioritized their own safety over prisoner security, making her way to the stables where loyal horses waited with infinite patience for riders who might never return. The ride to Standing Bear's winter camp had taken 2 days through terrain that tested every survival skill she'd acquired during frontier service. But Catherine McKenna was no longer the sheltered nun who'd arrived at Fort Randall 3 years earlier. She'd become someone harder and more resourceful, shaped by necessity, into whatever the children's rescue required. Now she knelt in snow-made crimson by her own blood, facing warriors whose anger was justified by generations of betrayal, carrying evidence that could either save the children or damn them all to deeper suffering. Standing Bear examined Morrison's financial records with the careful attention of a war chief evaluating enemy positions. His scarred fingers traced correspondence that documented profits generated by Lakota children's labor payment schedules that treated human beings like livestock, shipping manifests that listed souls as cargo. These papers speak truth, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated grief. But truth alone does not bring children home. Your Colonel Morrison has many soldiers, many guns, many friends in the white man's government. What can one woman with stolen papers accomplish against such power? Catherine met his gaze steadily, drawing strength from wooden horses that cut into her palms. One woman with stolen papers can expose the truth to people who profit from keeping it hidden. Morrison's operation depends on secrecy. Public knowledge would trigger investigations that could trace every stolen child, prosecute every participant, destroy the entire network. And how does a fugitive nun reach people with power to investigate federal policies? It was the crucial question one Catherine had wrestled with during her flight from Fort Randall. Direct appeals to territorial authorities would likely fail. Too many officials profited from Morrison's operations to risk honest investigation. But federal oversight might prove different, especially if evidence reached investigators whose careers depended on exposing rather than concealing corruption. The territorial circuit judge arrives next week for quarterly inspection, she explained. Judge Harrison has a reputation for integrity that makes him dangerous to men like Morrison. If these documents reach him with proper context and supporting testimony. Standing Bear nodded slowly, understanding the strategy while recognizing its limitations. One honest judge against a conspiracy that reaches into your capital. The odds are not favorable, medicine woman. No, Catherine agreed. But they're the only odds we have. Around them, the winter camp stirred with activity as warriors prepared for battles that might never come, and families maintained routines that created normalcy despite constant danger. Catherine watched children playing games that taught skills needed for survival, women crafting items that preserved cultural knowledge, elders sharing stories that connected past to future through threads stronger than government policies. This was what Morrison's operation sought to destroy, not just individual children, but an entire way of life that offered alternatives to industrial civilization's demands for conformity and submission. The stakes extended far beyond personal salvation, to encompass cultural survival for peoples who'd already endured too much loss. Chief Standing Bear. Catherine said carefully, "I need to ask something that may anger you, but I must know the truth. Why are you helping me? I've been an instrument of your people's suffering for 3 years. Why trust the woman who signed papers that stole your children?" Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the intensity of a hunter reading tracks in difficult terrain. "Because hatred serves no purpose when children are dying, medicine woman. Because my nephew spoke of the white teacher who let him keep wooden horses when others said they must be destroyed. Because sometimes enemies become allies when they choose justice over comfort." His words carried forgiveness that Catherine hadn't dared hope for, absolution that seemed too generous for crimes that had cost families everything they held sacred. But they also carried expectation. Redemption had to be earned through future service rather than past regret. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Everything," Standing Bear replied. "Your knowledge of white man's law, your connections to officials who might listen, your willingness to risk everything for children you'll never see again." His expression grew stern. "But understand this, the path ahead demands blood, yours or theirs. Are you prepared to shed both, if necessary?" Catherine thought of Joseph Little Thunder carving horses to honor his grandfather of Bright Star, weeping for the grandmother she'd never see again of Dancing Crane, whose mathematical gifts would be wasted in factory labor that valued only compliance over creativity. "I'm prepared," she said. Standing Bear stood his movement, followed by 20 warriors who'd watched their leader evaluate a white woman's worth according to standards that transcended racial boundaries. Around them, the hidden valley provided sanctuary that military maps didn't acknowledge, protected by knowledge that surveyors couldn't measure, and defended by loyalty that treaties couldn't legislate. "Then welcome to our family, medicine woman who walks between worlds," Standing Bear said, using a title that felt like baptism into service, larger than individual conscience. "Now, let us plan how to make your Colonel Morrison answer for his crimes." As Lakota fighters gathered around scattered evidence of systematic child trafficking, their voices discussing tactics in syllables that carried the weight of generations, Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. Not breaking healing. The woman who'd served institutions without questioning their methods was gone forever, replaced by someone dangerous enough to challenge systems that treated children as commodities. The war for stolen souls was about to begin, and Catherine McKenna intended to win it or die in the attempt. But victory would require more than good intentions and damning evidence. It would demand coordination between peoples who'd been enemies for decades, trust between individuals who had every reason for suspicion, and courage that transcended personal safety in service of children who deserved better than the choices their elders had made. Over the following weeks, Catherine discovered the sophistication of Lakota society that 3 years of civilization efforts had never taught her to recognize. Their winter camps were marvels of engineering that maximized warmth while providing defensive advantages. Their communication networks carried information faster than military telegraph systems. Their resource management sustained communities through conditions that defeated European expeditions. She also learned about the children Morrison had stolen, their names preserved in songs that kept memory alive, despite official efforts to erase their existence. Joseph Little Thunder, whose grandfather had trained horses for chiefs and warriors across the northern plains. Bright Star, whose beadwork had shown such promise that tribal elders had begun teaching her patterns reserved for honored women. dancing crane whose mathematical abilities had impressed even Catherine before his adoption to an Eastern boarding school that would waste his gifts on repetitive factory labor. Each story cut deeper than military reports that reduced children to statistics because Catherine had known these individuals personally. She'd praised Joseph's arithmetic, admired Bright Star's artwork, encouraged Dancing Crane's curiosity about engineering principles. She'd believed herself nurturing their potential while signing papers that destroyed their futures. The guilt serves no purpose now. Grandmother Willow told her one evening as they prepared medicinal plants by firelight. But the knowledge can serve justice if you let it guide your choices. The elderly healer's words carried wisdom that transcended cultural boundaries, reflecting understanding that redemption required action rather than remorse. Catherine's medical training proved invaluable in treating injuries that frontier conditions made inevitable. But her real contribution was intelligence that could save lives if properly utilized. The first rescue attempt came 6 weeks after her arrival, targeting a supply convoy that carried 12 Lakota children to Eastern facilities, along with legitimate military cargo that provided cover for trafficking operations. The plan required precise timing, detailed knowledge of military protocols, and coordination between groups that had been enemies for generations. Catherine provided intelligence about route schedules and guard rotations. Standing Bear designed tactical approaches that utilized terrain advantages, and surprisingly, Lieutenant Hayes created opportunity by reporting fictional hostile activity that diverted most convoy protection to investigate non-existent threats. I know what those adoption papers really mean now. Hayes had explained when he'd appeared at the Cottonwood cache with information that made the rescue possible. Colonel Morrison may have fooled me once, but I won't help him steal children again. The young officer's conversion from unwitting accomplice to active ally had provided Catherine with hope that individual conscience could triumph over institutional pressure, even among those whose careers depended on following orders without question. The rescue had succeeded brilliantly. 12 children returned to families who'd mourned them as lost forever, while official records showed only that hostile Indians had attacked military transports, scattered livestock, and disappeared into terrain too difficult for effective pursuit. No mention was made of missing children, because acknowledging their presence would expose trafficking operations that federal policy officially denied while secretly supporting. But success brought escalated danger. Morrison had begun noticing patterns in recent Indian activity: too much accurate intelligence, too perfect timing, too many operations that targeted specific vulnerabilities with precision that suggested inside knowledge. His response had been swift and methodical. False intelligence distributed through carefully monitored channels, each version slightly different, designed to identify the source. When Lakota forces responded to information only particular individuals could have provided. Catherine had discovered the trap too late to prevent Standing Bear's warriors from riding into an ambush that cost 8 lives, and revealed her survival to enemies who'd assumed her dead in the winter escape from Fort Randall. "He knows you live," Standing Bear had said grimly, as they'd counted casualties and treated wounded who might not survive wounds that proper medical facilities could easily heal. "Your Colonel Morrison now understands that his escaped prisoner has become his greatest threat." The observation had proven accurate within days. Military patrols had intensified throughout the region, their search patterns clearly designed to locate Catherine rather than random hostile activity. Reward notices had appeared offering significant payment for information leading to the capture of a dangerous fugitive nun who has allied herself with savage forces threatening American settlements. Morrison was mobilizing resources for a manhunt that would either recapture Catherine or eliminate her as a threat to operations that generated profits too substantial to risk losing to individual conscience. "We must move faster than he can plan," Standing Bear had decided. "The children cannot wait for perfect safety that may never come." They'd accelerated rescue operations, hitting 3 more convoys in 2 weeks, despite increased security that made each attempt more dangerous than the last. 27 children had been extracted from Morrison's pipeline, but each success had brought fiercer responses that escalated toward open warfare between military forces and Lakota warriors defending their families. The breaking point had come when Catherine had attempted to infiltrate Fort Randall, directly seeking evidence that could expose Morrison's network to federal authorities, whose jurisdiction superseded territorial corruption. Disguised as a frontier photographer, documenting military life for Eastern publications, she'd counted on changed appearance and assumed death to protect her identity during the dangerous reconnaissance. Morrison had recognized her anyway. Sister Catherine. He'd said, emerging from headquarters as she'd photographed supply wagons that carried legitimate cargo mixed with evidence of trafficking operations. Or perhaps I should say, Miss McKenna, given your abandonment of religious vows, I hear you found new calling among our local hostile population. Catherine's blood had turned to ice, but training in frontier survival had taught her to maintain composure under pressure that could prove fatal if mishandled. Colonel Morrison. I'm surprised you recognize me. I assumed I was presumed dead after that unfortunate incident during winter patrol. Presumed, yes. Confirmed, never. Morrison's smile had been cold as January wind. Walk with me, Catherine. We have considerable catching up to discuss. They'd strolled across the parade ground like old acquaintances, renewing friendship, while Morrison's guards had positioned themselves to prevent escape without appearing to threaten a civilian visitor. Other soldiers had watched with curiosity, recognizing neither the fugitive nun nor the frontier photographer, seeing only their commander conversing politely with someone whose presence required no immediate concern. You've cost me substantially, Morrison had said conversationally. 27 children returned to savage families instead of contributing to productive enterprises. 8 convoys disrupted schedules, delayed profits diminished considerably. His voice had hardened. Did you imagine such interference would pass unnoticed? Did you think I wouldn't connect your survival to these perfectly coordinated attacks? Catherine had maintained her photographer's persona while calculating distances to possible escape routes. Colonel, I'm afraid I don't understand your implications. My work documenting frontier life has kept me far from military operations. Catherine. Morrison had interrupted his patience, clearly exhausted. You still think like a nun, all moral absolutes and simple solutions. This operation enjoys federal backing, congressional approval, judicial oversight from the highest levels. We're not criminals hiding from justice. We're patriots implementing national policy designed to eliminate the Indian problem through permanent solutions. The revelation had hit Catherine like a physical blow, confirming suspicions she'd hoped were paranoid delusions. Morrison wasn't just stealing children for personal profit. He was executing official government strategy designed to destroy tribal culture through systematic separation of children from their heritage. The adoption program, she'd whispered pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. It's not corruption, it's policy. Exactly. Morrison's satisfaction had been evident. Remove Indian children from tribal influence, place them in productive environments that serve national interests, break cycles of savage resistance to civilized authority. Your signatures didn't enable crime. Catherine, they enabled justice as defined by elected representatives who understand that civilization sometimes requires harsh measures. Catherine had felt moral certainties crumbling around her as she'd recognized the implications. If Morrison was correct about federal sanction, then authorities she'd hoped would investigate trafficking operations would instead protect them as legitimate implementation of national security policy. You're lying, she'd said, but her voice had lacked conviction. Check congressional appropriations from the last 3 sessions. Morrison had replied confidently. Look for funding allocated to Native American educational transition and cultural integration programs. Read military circulars regarding pacification through systematic assimilation. This isn't rogue Operation Catherine. It's government policy implemented by patriotic Americans who understand that national survival requires elimination of primitive obstacles to progress. Morrison had gestured toward the fort's school building where Lakota children had sat in rigid rows, learning English grammar and Christian theology that prepared them for lives of industrial compliance rather than cultural preservation. Those children are being saved from lives of barbarism and poverty. He'd continued. The ones we place with Eastern families receive opportunities their savage parents could never provide. We're offering them futures, Catherine, real futures, in a civilized world that rewards productivity over primitive traditions. Standing in Morrison's shadow while winter light had filtered through windows that framed her former life, Catherine had recognized the seductive logic that had originally convinced her to participate in cultural destruction disguised as humanitarian assistance. Oh, what futures? She'd asked quietly. Factory labor, 16 hours daily, industrial accidents that maimed children too young to understand, workplace safety, wages too small to achieve independence from employers who own their contracts. Productive futures, Morrison had corrected. Labor that contributes to national prosperity education, that prepares them for citizenship roles, values that replace tribal superstition with Christian morality and American patriotism. His eyes had narrowed. What are you offering them, Catherine? Return to wigwams and warfare futures of hunting and gathering while the modern world progresses without them. Catherine had wanted to articulate the value of Lakota culture, the sophistication she'd discovered in tribal society, the richness of traditions Morrison dismissed as primitive obstacles to progress. But standing in the fort's courtyard, surrounded by evidence of American industrial power, she'd felt the weight of historical momentum that seemed to make resistance futile. Perhaps Morrison had been right. Perhaps her rescue efforts were misguided attempts to preserve ways of life that couldn't survive in the modern world. Perhaps the children would be better served by adaptation than resistance integration, than isolation futures that offered opportunity within American society, rather than poverty on reservations that offered only cultural preservation without economic viability. I see doubt in your eyes, Morrison had observed with satisfaction. Good. Doubt means you're thinking instead of merely feeling emotional responses to necessary changes. He'd paused to let implications settle. Consider this carefully, Catherine, which serves those children better integration into American society, with its opportunities for advancement or preservation in cultural isolation that offers only poverty and dependence on government charity. Before Catherine could respond, commotion had erupted near the fort's main gate. Riders had approached at speed federal couriers by their uniforms, carrying dispatch cases that had suggested urgent communications from regional headquarters requiring immediate command attention. Morrison had frowned, recognizing breach of normal protocol. Military couriers typically announced arrival through proper channels, requested permission to enter through established procedures, followed communication hierarchies that maintained order and security. These riders had been bypassing standard protocols, which usually meant emergency conditions or command-level orders that superseded normal operations. Colonel Morrison, the lead courier, had called out dismounting near headquarters, while his companions had secured their horses with the efficiency of men accustomed to rapid movement between distant posts. Federal investigative team en route from Washington. Require immediate access to all adoption program records, financial documentation, and administrative correspondence related to Indian education initiatives. Catherine had felt her heart leap with sudden hope that federal oversight might provide salvation she dared not expect. Investigation by Washington authorities meant someone with real power had discovered Morrison's operations, someone with jurisdiction to shut down trafficking networks and rescue children trapped in industrial slavery. But Morrison's reaction had surprised her completely. Instead of panic or concern that exposure might destroy his career, He'd shown only mild annoyance, like a man dealing with bureaucratic inconvenience, rather than criminal investigation that could end in execution for treason. "When do they arrive?" He'd asked the courier with casual interest. "Tomorrow morning, sir. Full investigative team with judicial oversight and military escort sufficient to ensure complete cooperation with federal inquiry." Morrison had nodded thoughtfully, already planning responses that suggested confidence rather than concern about federal scrutiny. "Very well. Prepare standard documentation packages according to established protocols. Ensure all records reflect proper procedures. Notify department heads of inspection requirements according to regulations." He'd turned to Catherine with expression approaching amusement. "It seems your federal cavalry has arrived, Miss McKenna. Shall we discover whether they're riding to your rescue or mine?" That evening, confined in fort quarters under polite but firm supervision that prevented escape while maintaining appearances of civilian courtesy, Catherine had wrestled with doubts that threatened to undermine everything she'd believed about justice, morality, and the righteousness of her desperate crusade. If Morrison had been truthful about federal sanction, if trafficking operations enjoyed official approval from highest government levels, then her rescue efforts weren't heroic resistance to individual corruption. And they were treasonous interference with national security policies designed to eliminate threats to American expansion and cultural dominance. But lying on a narrow cot that reminded her of convent life she'd abandoned. Staring at ceiling that reflected no answers to questions, that seemed to have no clear resolution, Catherine had found herself thinking. Not about government policies or political justifications, but about Joseph Little Thunder's wooden horses. A 7-year-old boy carving memories of grandfather, who taught him to ride ponies across prairies that existed before survey lines divided them into territories and townships. A child preserving cultural connection through art that spoke of love, tradition, and identity that couldn't be legislated away or processed into industrial productivity. Morrison could justify trafficking operations with patriotic rhetoric and civilizing missions that sounded noble in congressional speeches, but he couldn't explain away the look in Joseph's eyes when soldiers had dragged him from the only home he'd ever known. Federal policy might sanction separation, but it couldn't sanctify suffering that destroyed children's spirits while claiming to save their souls. Catherine's final transformation had begun that night, sparked not by political philosophy or moral theory, but by memory of child's tears and weight of wooden horses that carried more truth than all the official justifications Morrison could cite. Right and wrong weren't determined by government approval or social consensus. They were measured by consequences of choices made by individuals who had to live with what they'd done to other human beings. She'd signed papers that sent children into slavery, regardless of patriotic language that disguised the reality. She'd participated in cultural destruction, whatever civilizing missions provided official cover for systematic cruelty. No federal investigation could change that history. No government policy could justify personal betrayal of trust that children had placed in adults who claimed to serve their welfare. No civilizing mission could sanctify tears of 7-year-old boys torn from everything they loved by people who called themselves their saviors. But she could choose differently now. She could prioritize children over careers, conscience over compliance, love over laws that served power rather than justice. She could become someone worthy of trust. Standing Bear had offered someone deserving of redemption through service rather than rhetoric that justified whatever those in authority decided to impose on those without power to resist. Catherine McKenna had fallen asleep that night, planning escape routes and rescue strategies. Her mind focused not on political justifications, but on practical preparations for work that awaited beyond walls that confined her body, while liberating her spirit from institutions that demanded submission to systems she could no longer serve in good conscience. Dawn had brought federal investigators, and with them revelations that would change everything Catherine thought she understood about Morrison's operations and her own situation. The investigative team had consisted of 6 men in civilian clothes, backed by a full company of federal troops flying colors that indicated direct authority from Washington rather than territorial command. Their leader, Colonel James Mitchell, had possessed bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question by military personnel, regardless of their local rank or territorial influence. Catherine had watched from her window as Mitchell's forces had surrounded Fort Randall with movements precise and purposeful enough to suggest military occupation designed to prevent evidence destruction and ensure witness cooperation rather than routine inspection that could be deflected through careful preparation. This hadn't been administrative review. It had been federal seizure of operations suspected of violating laws that superseded territorial authority. Morrison had emerged from headquarters to greet investigators, his uniform immaculate and manner confident, despite circumstances that should have triggered concern in any officer engaged in unauthorized activities. Catherine couldn't hear conversation, but body language had suggested professional exchange between colleagues rather than adversarial confrontation between investigator and suspect. Her heart had sunk with recognition that Morrison might have been truthful about federal sanction. If he truly possessed official authorization for trafficking operations, then investigation would vindicate rather than condemn his activities. But 15 minutes later, everything had changed with dramatic suddenness that left no doubt about investigators' real purpose. Catherine had seen Morrison's posture shift from confident to defensive, as Mitchell had produced documents that made the colonel's face drain of color. Whatever federal investigators had revealed, it hadn't been what Morrison had expected or prepared to handle. Conversation had grown heated with Morrison, gesturing angrily, while Mitchell had remained impassive with authority that suggested complete confidence in his position. Other investigators had spread throughout the fort, heading toward file storage areas and financial offices with systematic efficiency of men who knew exactly what they were seeking and possessed legal authority to seize whatever they found. A knock at Catherine's door had interrupted her observation. Federal sergeant had entered, his manner respectful but firm with purpose that indicated official business rather than casual inquiry. Miss McKenna, Colonel Mitchell requests your immediate presence for testimony regarding trafficking operations conducted at this installation. Trafficking operations, not adoption programs or educational initiatives, trafficking. Federal government recognized Morrison's activities as criminal rather than patriotic, illegal rather than authorized by official policy that Morrison had claimed protected his operations from investigation or prosecution. Catherine had accompanied the sergeant to Morrison's office, where she'd found the colonel seated behind his desk, flanked by federal agents, his confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled desperation of man recognizing that carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. Miss McKenna, Colonel Mitchell had said, rising to greet her with courtesy that acknowledged her civilian status, while recognizing her potential importance to investigation that could determine multiple fates. I'm Colonel James Mitchell, federal prosecutor, investigating allegations of human trafficking in violation of federal law and international treaty obligations. We understand you possess evidence relevant to our inquiry. Catherine had glanced at Morrison, who watched her with eyes that promised violence if she testified against him. But presence of federal agents had emboldened her in ways that standing alone never could. I have extensive evidence, she'd confirmed, pulling Morrison's financial records from her coat. Documents proving systematic trafficking of Lakota children, correspondence with Eastern industrialists' payment schedules, treating human beings as commodity goods. Mitchell had examined papers with growing satisfaction. These corroborate intelligence we've gathered from other sources. Can you verify their authenticity? I photographed them from Colonel Morrison's private files, Catherine had replied. The originals should still be in his office safe. Morrison's face had flushed red with fury and desperation. Those documents were stolen. This woman is a disgraced nun who abandoned her vows to consort with hostile Indians. Her testimony is worthless. On the contrary, Mitchell had said mildly, her testimony is invaluable, especially combined with financial records we've obtained from Eastern manufacturers who purchased child labor through military contacts. He'd looked at Morrison with something approaching contempt. Did you think a conspiracy this large could operate without federal notice, indefinitely? Catherine had felt pieces falling into place with clarity that transformed confusion into understanding. The investigation hadn't been triggered by her intelligence or Standing Bear's raids. It had been developing independently, following money trails and labor contracts that eventually led back to Morrison's operation. "How long have you been investigating?" she'd asked. 8 months, Mitchell had replied. Ever since Treasury agents noticed irregularities in military appropriations and labor contract payments that didn't match official adoption program budgets. Your evidence provides the final link between military personnel and trafficking networks. Morrison had stood abruptly, his hand moving toward his sidearm, with desperation of man who had nothing left to lose. "I won't be destroyed by lies from traitors and savages." Federal agents had reacted instantly, weapons drawn and trained on Morrison before his pistol had cleared its holster. The colonel had frozen, recognizing that resistance would mean immediate death. "But Colonel Morrison," Mitchell had said calmly, "you're under arrest for trafficking in human beings, violation of treaty obligations, fraud against the United States government, and conspiracy to commit forced labor. Surrender your weapon and submit to federal custody." Morrison's hand had trembled on his gun butt, calculating odds that offered no realistic chance of escape. Finally, he'd released the weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "This won't stop anything," he'd said bitterly. "You'll arrest me, prosecute me, maybe execute me. But the system will continue. Other officers will take my place, other facilities will process the children, other contracts will maintain the flow of labor. You can't stop national interests with individual prosecutions." Mitchell's smile had been sharp as a blade. "Watch us." As federal agents had secured Morrison and begun seizing his files, Catherine had felt weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Justice was possible after all. The system could be held accountable. The children might actually come home. But relief had been tempered by recognition that this victory was only the beginning. Morrison had been right about one thing: trafficking networks extended far beyond his individual operation. Stopping him wouldn't automatically free children already enslaved in Eastern factories. "Colonel Mitchell," she'd said, "I have contacts among the Lakota who can help locate stolen children and coordinate their return to families. Will the federal government support repatriation efforts?" Mitchell had nodded firmly. "Miss McKenna, the president himself has authorized whatever resources are necessary to remedy this situation. We'll need your continued cooperation in identifying victims and establishing contact with tribal authorities." Catherine had thought of Standing Bear waiting in winter camp, wondering whether his white ally had succeeded or failed in her desperate mission. "I'll need to return to the Lakota immediately. They're planning military action based on assumption that federal authorities won't help. If they attack while you're here, a misunderstanding that could escalate into unnecessary bloodshed." Mitchell had agreed. "Can you arrange meeting with tribal leadership?" "Chief Standing Bear will meet with federal representatives if you can guarantee safe conduct and demonstrate genuine commitment to returning the children." Catherine had paused, recognizing delicate diplomacy required. "He's been betrayed by too many government promises to trust words alone." "Then we'll provide actions," Mitchell had said firmly. "Starting with immediate release of all Lakota children currently held at this facility." That afternoon, Catherine had ridden out of Fort Randall alongside federal convoy, carrying 12 freed children toward their families, their faces bright with excitement despite bitter wind that swept across prairie. Behind them, Morrison had sat in chains in prison wagon, his empire of exploitation crumbling as federal agents dismantled his operation piece by piece. But ahead had lain more difficult challenge of building trust between peoples who'd been enemies for generations, of healing wounds that went deeper than individual crimes, of creating systems that prioritized justice over convenience. Standing Bear's camp had erupted in celebration when federal convoy arrived with 12 freed children and promises of more to follow. Catherine had watched families reunite with members they'd mourned as dead, listened to tears of joy, replace songs of grief, witnessed love triumph over despair, in ways that made federal policies seem pale and powerless. But not everyone had celebrated. Two Eagles, one of Standing Bear's sub-chiefs, had viewed government delegation with suspicion that years of betrayal had earned. "You trust them because they helped you," he'd said to Catherine as federal representatives had pitched tents near camp's edge. But trust must be earned through seasons, not moments. How do we know they won't take what they want and leave us with nothing as others have done? It had been a fair question, one Catherine couldn't answer with certainty. Federal policy had betrayed tribal trust repeatedly. Treaties, broken promises, abandoned good intentions, corrupted by political convenience. Why should this time be different? Because this time you have leverage, she'd said, showing Two Eagles' financial records that had exposed Morrison's network. The trafficking operation involves powerful people who can't afford public exposure. Congressional leaders, military commanders, industrial magnates, all vulnerable to prosecution if evidence becomes public. Standing Bear had studied documents with calculating attention of war chief, evaluating enemy positions. "You suggest we threaten to expose their crimes. If they don't return our children, I suggest we demand justice as price of our silence," Catherine had corrected. Not just return of stolen children, but prosecution of everyone involved, compensation for families destroyed, and guarantees that this never happens again. It had been dangerous strategy leveraging federal authorities with evidence of their own corruption, but it had also been only advantage Lakota possessed against opponents who controlled armies, courts, and legislation. Colonel Mitchell had proved surprisingly receptive when Standing Bear had presented demands through Catherine's translation. Chief Standing Bear drives hard bargain, he'd observed reading through requirements. But his terms are reasonable given scope of injustice your people have endured. Negotiations had lasted 3 days, with Catherine serving as translator, mediator, and advocate for children who couldn't speak for themselves. Final agreement had included immediate repatriation of all trafficked Lakota children, federal prosecution of everyone involved in conspiracy, financial compensation for affected families, and establishment of tribal oversight for any future educational programs. More importantly, it had included recognition of Lakota authority over their own children's welfare precedent that could protect future generations from similar exploitation. Over following months, as federal agents worked to locate and repatriate trafficked children, Catherine had discovered true scope of conspiracy Morrison had served. Trafficking network had reached into Congress, military command, industrial leadership, and church hierarchy, hundreds of powerful men who'd profited from Lakota, suffering while claiming moral authority. Each rescue operation had brought its own challenges. Some children had been held so long they'd forgotten native language, requiring patient re-education in Lakota culture and customs. Others had borne physical scars from industrial labor. Missing fingers, respiratory damage, developmental stunting that spoke of systematic abuse disguised as productive employment. Emotional wounds had run deeper still. Children who'd learned to distrust all authority, who'd flinched from adult touch, who'd woken screaming from nightmares filled with factory noise and overseer violence. Catherine's medical training had proved invaluable in treating physical injuries, but healing psychological trauma had required skills she'd still been learning. "They look at us like strangers," Singing Crane had observed, whose daughter had been returned after 2 years in Pennsylvania textile mill. "She speaks English words I don't understand, flinches when I try to hold her, asks for food she's never eaten." Catherine had had no easy answers for families struggling to reconnect with children who'd been systematically alienated from their own culture. Recovery had taken time, patience, and resources that frontier conditions had made scarce. But gradually, inevitably, healing had begun. Children had remembered songs their grandmothers had taught them, rediscovered games they'd played before abduction, reconnected with languages that industrial overseers had tried to beat out of them. Human capacity for resilience had proved stronger than institutional attempts at cultural destruction. Joseph Little Thunder had been among last children recovered found in Boston factory, where he'd worked 16-hour days assembling mechanical components. When Catherine had seen him step off repatriation train, she'd barely recognized boy she'd known taller, thinner, marked by experiences no 8-year-old should endure. But when she'd offered him wooden horses she'd carried for months, his face had lit up with recognition that bridged gap between past and present. "You kept them," he'd whispered in English, then repeated words in Lakota as memory had returned. "You kept them safe." "They kept me safe," Catherine had replied, kneeling to his level. "Every time I looked at them, I remembered why we were fighting to bring you home." Joseph had taken horses with hands that bore calluses from factory work, examining each carving with attention of someone reacquainting himself with forgotten dreams. "I made new ones in factory," he'd said quietly. "But foremen took them away. Said Indians don't make toys. Indians make whatever they choose to make," Catherine had assured him. "And you're home now, where no one can take your creations away." That evening, as Joseph had carved new horses by firelight, while his family had sung welcome songs, Catherine had reflected on strange journey that had brought her from mission school conformity to Lakota advocacy. She'd lost religious vocation, institutional identity, comfortable certainties about civilization and progress, but she'd gained something more valuable: purpose that served life rather than ideology, relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority, faith grounded in love rather than fear of divine punishment. Not everyone had accepted her transformation easily. Some Lakota had continued to view her with suspicion despite proven loyalty. During one painful confrontation, Mourning Dove, whose son had died in industrial accident before rescue efforts could reach him, had challenged Catherine's motives publicly. "Around, why should we trust the woman who signed papers that killed my child?" she demanded before assembled tribal council. "She says she seeks redemption, but redemption for what? For serving our enemies, or for failing to serve them better?" Catherine had accepted criticism without defense, recognizing its legitimacy. Her complicity in Morrison's operations had cost lives, destroyed families, inflicted suffering that no subsequent service could fully remedy. "I can't bring back your son," she'd said simply. "I can't undo papers I signed or erase harm I caused. All I can do is spend whatever life remains to me ensuring no more children disappear while good people look away." Mourning Dove had studied Catherine's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then do that work, medicine woman. But remember always whose blood purchases your redemption." The exchange had reminded Catherine that healing required acknowledgement of genuine harm, not just good intentions moving forward. Her journey from complicity to advocacy was personal transformation, but it was also political act that challenged systems designed to obscure responsibility for collective crimes. Building school together with Standing Bear had become model that spread throughout American West, proving education could honor cultural diversity while preparing children for success in changing world. Catherine McKenna, former Sister Catherine who'd signed adoption papers in ignorance, had become Dr. Catherine McKenna, educator, who'd helped establish first tribally controlled schools in American history. She'd never returned to Ireland, never reconciled with Catholic Church, never received official recognition for contributions to civil rights and educational reform. But she'd found something more valuable than institutional approval: knowledge that her life had served justice rather than convenience, love rather than fear, truth rather than comfortable lies. On winter evenings when snow fell across Dakota plains and children gathered around fires to hear stories of courage and redemption, Catherine would pull out Joseph Little Thunder's wooden horses and remember boy who'd carved them in defiance of world that wanted to forget his name. Horses were older now, their carved surfaces worn smooth by countless tellings, their presence reminder that even smallest acts of love could survive largest attempts at destruction. Like children who'd come home, like families who'd been reunited, like school that proved education could honor both heritage and hope. Catherine McKenna had found her calling at last, not in rigid structures of religious institutions or comfortable certainties of cultural superiority, but in messy, complicated, infinitely rewarding work of helping children find their own paths between worlds that had been kept apart too long, and in one-room schoolhouse, where Lakota children learned mathematics in their own language and English poetry, that honored their own experience, where traditional songs shared time with modern science and ancient wisdom informed contemporary choices. Wooden horses stood on Catherine's desk as testament to power of love to triumph over systems designed to destroy it. Some battles Catherine had learned were worth fighting regardless of odds. Some children were worth saving regardless of cost. Some bridges were worth building regardless of rivers they had to span. Woman who'd once signed adoption papers believing she was saving souls had become someone who actually did save souls, not through religious conversion or cultural assimilation, but through simple recognition that every child deserved chance to choose their own future from position of strength, knowledge, and love. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that mattered in a world where wooden horses could survive industrial machinery, where children's laughter could triumph over institutional cruelty, where one woman's journey from complicity to courage could help transform how nations treated their most vulnerable members.